tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
This is Chad Graham with Thinker Sensitive on the rise of socialism. I'm here with Ben Crenshaw, my co-host, and Nicholas Mashanya for the episode on free market versus command economy. Guys, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Chad.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so before we compare the two, I think we need some good definitions of what a free market is and what a command economy is. So Ben, I'm going to kick this over to you. Tell us about what a free market is.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about market economies and command economies, we're talking about economies. So we need to understand what economics is. And the best definition of economics comes from Thomas Sowell's book, Basic Economics, where he says that economics is the use of scarce resources that have alternate uses.
Wait, Ben, can you say that again? What's the definition of economics?
It's the use of scarce resources that have alternate uses.
Okay.
So there's kind of three components here. The first is scarce resources. And the issue with economics is that God created the world with all kinds of resources, but there aren't enough to go around. There's scarcity in the world. And there's always higher demand among people who want to use those resources than there are resources to use. Now, something like oxygen is not a scarce resource, so we don't have economics about oxygen, but we do for oil and for water and for all other kinds of resources. When I say resources, it's easy to really kind of think about natural resources, but knowledge is a resource.
Right.
Human capital in terms of labor or the tools of industry. All kinds of things that we create are resources as well. So there's scarcity in the world, and economics is trying to deal with that scarcity. How do we use these resources? And so the first component is scarcity. The second component is use, and that deals with human action. And this is why the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises wrote an entire book called Human Action, because that's how he would have defined economics. So we're talking about humanity's use of these resources. And so when we talk about human action, we don't just have issues of, say, well, gee, should we refine this oil and put it in cars, or should we refine it and use it as plastic? We're also talking about things like what's the just, the good, the most equitable and fair use of these resources. So we're going to pull in other components, values. And the final issue is that all of these uses of these scarce resources have alternate uses. And so in economics, this is what's known as opportunity cost. You could take your money and you could eat lunch with it, or you could invest it. And whatever you don't end up doing is your opportunity cost. So there's resources, and they could always be used for something else.
Right.
So we always have to make decisions, and that's why economics is always about comparative. This or this cost or this cost, compared to what? Compared to what? That's what we're always asking.
Yeah.
So when it comes to a market economy, they organize this whole idea of the use of scarce resources that have alternate uses around basically the individual and individuals who cooperate together within families or business partnerships or communities and so forth. And so this is why they prioritize property rights, prices being set by the market, being able to sell, barter, exchange within a market system that's voluntary, and so forth. So it's a decentralized system that places priority upon the individual and the free associations that individuals may make with one another. On the flip side, you have a command economies, which kind of push the individual aside for the collective, so to speak, or the state's decisions, economic decisions by the power elites, those in government, those elected to government, and so forth. So property is not seen as important. Prices can be set high or low depending upon the kind of outcomes that they want to see. Higher, say, prices for wages in order to give people a better life, a living wage idea. And regulation, lots of regulation for businesses that they think are getting too big, or CEOs who are getting too much pay, or goods or services that they think are harming the common good, and so forth. So one is very decentralized, the other is very centralized, but both of them are concerned with how we use scarce resources that have alternate uses.
So, I mean, I hear this all the time in our culture today that one of those, a free market, is essentially based on greed, opportunism, where the other one, command economies, are based off of a philosophy of shared wealth, common values. How do you answer those typologies? Are they helpful? Are they accurate? Are they true?
Yeah, I don't think they're either helpful or true.
Yeah.
Let's think about market economies for a minute. Well, maybe we should go back and talk about what greed is. That's maybe a good place to start, because you can be greedy and be poor. So there's nothing about either freedom or oppression or wealth or poverty that determines whether or not you're greedy or not. Mm-hmm. So greed is it's a disposition, it's a character of the soul. And so there's nothing particularly about an economic system that either determines you're greedy or whatnot. Now, people will say, well, the market kind of runs off greed. That's kind of the term. And I suppose it could. You could have people who are greedy, but what's more important to understand about the market is that it's really a system of freedom. You have just as many people who are altruistic and charitable and philanthropic within the market. And what do? They work hard, they save hard, and they give a lot away. Or they invest a lot of money, and they use that venture capital to create a business, which then creates employment, which then creates goods and businesses for other people. That's not greed. That's an economic system of freedom that gives people the opportunity to invest and work and help others. So
it's valid self-interest that there's always this temptation to go from self-interest to greed, right?
Yeah.
At the expense of others, taking in too much, having excess, things like that.
Exactly. And you mentioned it, Chad, the distinction between greed and self-interest. If you read Alexander de Tocqueville, he talks about, in his book, Democracy in America, he talks about self-interest rightly understood. Mm-hmm. And self-interest rightly understood means that God has created all of us with this appropriate concern for our own health and well-being, and that is in relationship to Him and to others. So if I don't care for myself by eating well and sleeping well and working hard and taking care of myself, that's going to hurt my wife. It's going to hurt my friends because I'm hurting myself. So self-interest is valid. We do it all the time. And guess what? Because we're fallible people, we can't be concerned about everybody else all the time. I can't be saying, like, I'm going to buy a sandwich from Jimmy John's today, and I have to figure out, how I'm going to act charitably in doing this. It would just overwhelm people. Mm-hmm. If every economic decision they had to make had to be some kind of selfless, charitable interaction with another person.
So what about command economies? Are they really based off of completely altruistic, community-minded, community-centered values?
Well, they try to be. They say they are, and I don't think they can achieve that. For example, let's just take the value of equality. Well, they value equality of results. And they think that that's a charitable way to act if we redistribute goods, monies, services, and so forth so that everybody can partake in them equitably. The problem is that there's at least 5 different kinds of equality. You have equality from your createdness in God's image. You have equality from your intrinsic skills or abilities, and oftentimes those are unequal.
Right.
We have equality of opportunity. So we should hopefully remove barriers that could prevent people from having the opportunities to do things, even though the nature of the world is that we don't all have the same opportunities.
Right.
When we have equality of treatment, equal treatment under the law. And the last one, of course, is equality of results. So the question is, what kind of equality are you going to prioritize? And what happens under a socialist system is in order to get to the equality of results, you essentially have to ignore or override in an inhumane way the first 4 types of equality.
Okay, so now that we understand the 2 categories of free market versus command economy, do we have real-life current examples or historical examples of these 2 types of economies?
Well, I think there's one example, at least, that shows the benefit of a free market. When I think about India, that was where the economic system in India kind of adopted a Soviet understanding of how to order their market for about 5.5 decades. Right up until the 80s, when they finally had enough socialism, they were seeing these well springs of poverty all over India. And some of that really has a lot to do with imperialism and the history of India, but it also has a lot to do with socialism and how they ordered their markets. And we see why that was the case, because instantly in the 80s, when they make the shift to privatize banks, when they make the shift to allow industry to be privatized, like oil industries and other transportation markets, we see India emerge in the span of a decade into a global market again. And China had roughly the same outcome in the 70s, when China finally was tired of being only an export country, and they changed their banking system. They allow privatized banking to emerge. They allow industries to be privatized. They still have government-sanctioned, government-controlled transportation and oil industries, but they also accompany some private businesses, and they become the biggest economy in the planet. And so I think they're real examples of countries that deregulate, that desocialize, and immediately they experience this flourishing, this economic boom that launches them into the global economy.
Yeah, you can see this trend all over the place. I mean, you look at the difference between North and South Korea. South Korea, of course, is liberalized economically and politically. And when you look at their picture on a map from space at night, it's black and light. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Deepak Lal is a development economist with the World Bank, and then he was with Cato Institute. And he wrote a book called Poverty and Progress, and recently, about 5 years ago or so. And he traced kind of this trend of liberalizing economic and political orders and how it had a tremendous impact on the depreciation of poverty. So poverty has dropped incredible amounts from, I can't remember the exact numbers, but something in the hundreds of millions, 500 million, 600 million living on $1 a day, to like less than 120 million, something absurd like that. And it's not because, centralized governments got together and gave out more slush funds or foreign aid or something like that. It's because, you put the power of work and remuneration for labor and the choice within communities on how they want to organize themselves, what goods and products they want to sell on a world market, and the way they want to order their own lives economically. And when you do that, you find this incredible progress and prosperity.
Ben, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's always a pleasure having you. Stay tuned for our next few episodes. We have one more comparative episode between socialism and communism. And then we have a couple of policy episodes coming up: universal basic income, universal health care, and free college tuition. Thanks, guys, for being on the show today.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
For more Thinker-Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com. Be sure to find us on iTunes and YouTube as well.